In February 1965, 13 executives from Dow Chemical Corporation sat down together to discuss a problem their own laboratories had found. The chemical was a contaminant called dioxin, produced as a byproduct in the manufacture of one of the two herbicides that, mixed together, would become known to the world as Agent Orange. Dow's own scientists had already documented it causing severe liver damage in test animals. One of the company's researchers, in a private memo, described the substance in blunt terms of his own: exceptionally toxic, with a tremendous potential for producing chloracne and systemic injury. The executives discussed what to do about it. What they agreed on was not to test further, or to warn the customer, or to change the formulation. They agreed the situation had to stay contained before it could, in the words later recovered from the meeting notes, explode into a new wave of government regulation for the entire chemical industry. Dow's public position on dioxin, for years afterward, was that it occurred naturally in the environment and posed no meaningful risk to humans. The government that was buying millions of gallons of that herbicide, and the soldiers who would spend years being sprayed with it, standing under the same aircraft that dropped it, were never told what the room in February 1965 had actually concluded. That is one half of this story. The other half belongs to the government itself, and it took much longer to surface because, unlike a single corporate memo, it involved killing the same piece of research not once, but twice, over the course of a decade, using entirely legitimate-looking scientific and bureaucratic procedure each time. To understand what was being hidden, you have to understand what the herbicide was actually meant to do. Between 1961 and 1971, the United States military sprayed more than 11 million gallons of Agent Orange and related herbicides across the forests and farmland of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, under a program called Operation Ranch Hand. The purpose was straightforward and, on its own terms, effective: strip the jungle canopy that concealed enemy movement and destroy the crops that fed them. It worked as a military tactic. Vast stretches of forest turned to standing dead wood within weeks of a single pass. What traveled with the herbicide, inseparably, was dioxin, specifically the compound TCDD, a contaminant produced during manufacture of one of Agent Orange's two active ingredients. It is not a mild toxin. It is one of the most potent synthetic compounds ever studied, active in the human body at concentrations measured in parts per trillion, and by the standards of toxicology available even in the 1960s, it did not belong anywhere near a food or water supply, let alone sprayed directly over people. The government's own scientists found evidence of the danger early, and it did not stop the program. By 1963, government researchers had already found that dioxin caused birth defects in laboratory mice. Spraying continued for 8 more years. By the time Operation Ranch Hand ended in 1971, hundreds of thousands of American service members had served in areas that were sprayed, alongside millions of Vietnamese civilians whose exposure was never systematically tracked at all. The military's own herbicide use was formally discontinued around 1970, as concerns about developmental harm finally accumulated enough weight to end the program, though by then the exposure had already happened, for a decade, to everyone who had been there. The veterans started getting sick in the years that followed, and they started noticing something else too: their children. Elevated rates of certain cancers, soft tissue sarcomas, a skin condition called chloracne, one of the most direct and visible markers of dioxin exposure. Birth defects in children conceived after their fathers returned. None of it, on its own, proved anything in a courtroom or a government office, because proving causation in human populations, years after a chemical exposure nobody had carefully measured at the time, is genuinely difficult science. That difficulty is real, and it is also exactly the gap that the next 20 years of this story would be fought over. The Veterans Administration's initial response, through the late 1970s, was measured and largely defensive. It established a registry in 1978 to track veterans reporting Agent Orange exposure, assigned physicians at its medical centers to gather information, and over the following years stood up a series of internal offices with serious-sounding names: the Agent Orange Projects Office, the Chloracne Task Force, the Data Analysis Task Force. What those offices mostly did, for most of a decade, was produce studies that found no conclusive link between dioxin exposure and long-term illness, while acknowledging, in the same reports, that it was extremely difficult to determine which veterans had actually been exposed and by how much, since the military had never systematically recorded who stood under the spray and who did not. That gap in the data was not a neutral scientific problem. It became, repeatedly, the mechanism by which findings of no association were reached, not because the health effects weren't there, but because the exposure could never be pinned down precisely enough to prove they were. In the early 1980s, under congressional pressure, Congress mandated a serious federal epidemiological study to be run by the Centers for Disease Control. It was meant to be the definitive word: large-scale, government-funded, methodologically rigorous, finally answering the question that a decade of smaller VA studies had failed to resolve. It was killed twice. The first killing happened quietly, from inside the research itself. The CDC study, as originally designed, was meant to examine specific health outcomes, including a mortality study looking at causes of death among exposed veterans compared to those who had not served in sprayed areas. Internal decisions by the CDC research team overseeing that mortality component ended it 2 years earlier than originally planned, a shortened timeline that critics, including scientists reviewing the work afterward, argued was specifically structured to prevent a statistically significant association between dioxin exposure and the illnesses veterans were reporting from ever fully emerging in the data. Cut a longitudinal study short enough, and you do not need to falsify a single number. You simply ensure the sample never accumulates enough deaths over enough years to reach statistical significance, and then you report, honestly, that no significant association was found. The second killing was more direct, and it reached all the way to the White House. The CDC's separate, larger exposure study, the one meant to determine which veterans had actually been exposed to Agent Orange and how much, using military records to reconstruct troop movements against spraying data, ran into a different obstacle. In 1987, the physician overseeing the project, Dr. Vernon Hook, concluded that military records were simply too unreliable to determine exposure levels for individual soldiers. Rather than pursuing alternative methods, Hook proposed a substitute: take blood samples from 646 Vietnam veterans, selected based on their probable exposure, and measure current dioxin levels directly. The tests came back showing no elevated dioxin levels in the sampled group. This was, to most toxicologists who reviewed it afterward, entirely unsurprising and essentially meaningless. The men had left Vietnam roughly 20 years earlier. Dioxin does not remain in the bloodstream indefinitely at detectable levels after that much time, and none of those specifically tested had handled the herbicide directly in the first place. It was a test almost guaranteed to come back clean, regardless of what had actually happened to these men in 1968. Hook used the negative result anyway to argue that if these veterans showed no elevated dioxin now, then Pentagon spraying records could not reliably be used to identify exposure in the broader veteran population at all. On the strength of that argument, the White House Domestic Policy Council cancelled the entire CDC exposure study in September 1987. $43 million had already been spent on it. A CDC official, Dr. Daniel Hoffman, told the press at the time that there was no risk associated with dioxin exposure documented in the study. Veterans organizations were appalled. A spokesman for the American Legion said it publicly at the time. The conclusion made it sound as though Agent Orange were no more dangerous than orange juice. This is where the story might have ended, filed and closed, the way most of the cover-ups in this series stay filed and closed for decades. It did not end there, because of one man with a very specific, very personal reason not to let it go. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt had commanded American naval forces in Vietnam, and it was Zumwalt himself, as the Navy's top officer in the region, who had ordered Agent Orange sprayed along the riverbanks of the Mekong Delta to protect his own patrol boats from ambush. His son, Elmo Zumwalt III, served on those same patrol boats, in those same sprayed areas. His son developed lymphoma, and later, a second, unrelated cancer. He died in 1988, at 42. In 1990, the Department of Veterans Affairs asked Zumwalt to conduct an independent review of the government's Agent Orange science. What he produced was not a gentle report. Zumwalt concluded that government and industry scientists had manipulated research data to obscure clear evidence linking Agent Orange to cancers, birth defects, and a range of other conditions in both veterans and their children. His report stated plainly that experts who reviewed the government's own advisory committee findings disagreed with them and specifically questioned the validity of how the committee had assessed the evidence on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the very disease that had killed his son. That report was, at the time, classified. It has since been declassified and is now part of the public record veterans use in seeking compensation to this day. The same year, a House of Representatives committee ran its own investigation, and its findings, released in August 1990 under the title The Agent Orange Cover-Up, A Case of Flawed Science and Political Manipulation, did not soften the language at all. The committee concluded that the 1987 CDC study should never have been cancelled, that the agency had not actually demonstrated exposure could not be assessed, and had not seriously explored alternative methods before pulling the plug. It went further, finding that the cancellation had been directed from the White House itself, and that officials in the Reagan administration had deliberately controlled and obstructed the study, specifically because the government did not want to acknowledge liability in the compensation cases already working through the courts and the VA system. Two separate investigations, one military and one congressional, running independently, reached the same conclusion from different directions. The flaw was not in the science's difficulty. The flaw was in who kept deciding, at every turn, how that difficulty would be resolved. The consequence, finally, was legislative rather than scientific. On the 6th of February, 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed the Agent Orange Act. For the first time, Congress legally established a set of presumptive conditions, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, soft tissue sarcomas, chloracne among them, for which a Vietnam veteran no longer had to individually prove Agent Orange exposure caused their illness. Service in Vietnam itself became sufficient grounds for VA compensation, shifting the impossible burden of 2 decades of contested exposure records off the shoulders of individual sick veterans, and onto a legal presumption instead. The Act also directed the National Academy of Sciences to conduct an independent, ongoing scientific review, one insulated, deliberately, from the political pressure that had shaped the CDC's work throughout the 1980s. That review process, through the Institute of Medicine, has continued in biennial updates for more than 3 decades since, gradually expanding the list of conditions recognized as associated with herbicide exposure, using the kind of sustained, unhurried research that a properly funded, uninterrupted federal study might have produced decades earlier, if either study had ever been allowed to run its course. So here is where this one lands, and it has a structure unlike most of what has come before it in this series. There was no single sealed envelope here, no 30-year rule, no crowbar through an office door. There were 2 parallel institutions, a chemical company and a federal government, independently arriving at the same method of concealment, years apart, using entirely different tools. Dow buried its own internal findings inside a private meeting and a public statement that contradicted it. The government buried its findings inside a legitimate-looking scientific process, cut short at exactly the point where a real answer might have emerged, twice, using the ordinary bureaucratic language of budget constraints and methodological limitations. Neither cover-up required a single document to be destroyed. Dow's 1965 memo survived. It was simply never shown to the people using the product. The CDC's cancelled study survived as a paper trail of memos and decisions. It simply never became the completed research it was funded to be. Everything anyone needed to know was written down twice, once by a chemical company that knew what it was selling in 1965, and once by a government whose own scientists suspected the danger by 1963 and kept spraying for 8 more years regardless. Both documents survived. What was destroyed, twice, in 2 different decades, by 2 different institutions, was the study that would have forced either of them to say so out loud.